Chapter 6 of Stones and Water. Stones. The girl seemed to develop some sixth sense, for she always knew precisely when Roberta was coming with food. She positioned herself in a different spot every time close to the wires, but somewhere near one pole. Sometimes midway between poles, sometimes near another pole. That was smart. That way the soldier on guard was less likely to recognize that it was the same girl Roberta walked up to twice a day. And she usually came without her sister. She'd put the girl on some woman's lap, or she'd set to digging a hole with her bare fingers, or she'd sit down beside another small child. That was smart, too. The little girl was maybe old enough to figure out that Roberta was the source of the food, but not old enough to be counted on to know how not to give away a secret with her eyes or hands or body. And Roberto did his own smart things. He made sure he went over to the pen at other times than just when he was giving the girl food. He walked by and stood with both hands in his pockets for a moment before breakfast and again before dinner. He found a few stones around the size of eggs and put them in his pockets. He took them out and rubbed them when he knew a soldier was watching. That way, anyone who saw him with food in his pocket would think he just had those stones. He was acting almost clever. Memo would have been proud of him. Enzo was. Enzo told him he was smarter and braver than anyone else he'd ever known. It couldn't be true, but it made Roberto feel good anyway. Roberto wasn't sure. He thought he'd been feeding the girl for more than a week. She looked stronger, maybe, despite the fact that she slept on the ground in the pen. Her sister looked stronger, too. The little girl's lips were no longer swollen and red, though the scabs hadn't fallen off yet. And neither of them had been beaten, so far as he knew. Beatings of the Jews were erratic and random. The girl and her sister had been lucky. And Enzo seemed to have grown accustomed to eating the raw eggs. He still didn't like them, and he assumed that Roberto didn't like them either, so he worked hard to make eating them a kind of game. He'd tell Roberto to concentrate and listen closely, and then he'd describe a wondrous feast, and they'd eat fast while the vision was fresh in their heads. Enzo ate 2 raw eggs at breakfast and 2 more at dinner. Roberto did the same. It wasn't a bad arrangement. Roberto, Enzo, the girl, her little sister, no one was starving. Enzo seemed to thrive on it despite his disgust. He just kept moving in stride, even last night when Roberto had made the mistake of taking eggs out of the nests on the top shelf of the chicken coop. Roberto worried that if he took from the same nests all the time, the farmer might notice that the hen wasn't laying as many as she used to. So he was careful to take from different nests. He had already taken from every nest on the middle and bottom shelves. That's why he started on the top shelf. Roberto and Enzo cracked the eggs open last night only to find tiny chicks curled up just days from hatching. Enzo popped a chick into his mouth whole and chewed hard, his lips pressed together tight. Roberto wanted to do the same, but even with his eyes closed, he couldn't bring himself to put a chick in his mouth. To Roberto, the difference between a raw egg and a raw chick was the difference between the sun and the moon. But to Enzo, they were equally disgusting. So Enzo ate all 3 of them, spitting out the tiny beaks and feet. At breakfast this morning, Roberto was careful to pick from the nests on the middle shelf. He would never raid a nest on the top shelf again. Roberto wondered now if the formed chicks somehow held more nutrition than fresh eggs, because Enzo seemed to work even better today than usual. Oh, Roberto and Enzo were the 2 hardest workers among the boys, no matter what the job was. They cut more wood, they dug deeper holes, they swung picks without slowing hour after hour, day after day. But right now, Enzo walked ahead of Roberto faster and stronger than Roberto had ever seen him, as though nothing could tire him out. They carried boxes from the trucks that had rolled in yesterday afternoon over to the shed the boys had built. Tonight or maybe tomorrow night a plane would come and they would load the boxes from the shed onto the plane. They had finished the first truck's load and made decent headway on the others. Arbiter shouted and the boys lined up to be dismissed for a short break. The sun was high, shade would be welcome. For no reason, Roberto looked over at the pen. A few of the people were walking around. The girl was one of them, and she was looking right at him. When their eyes met, she straightened her ripped shirt so that it covered her properly. Her modesty made his cheeks hot and his throat hurt. He was ashamed for all these German soldiers, ashamed for himself. The girl walked up to the wires and stooped down. Then she walked away without a glance backward. Roberto went over to where she'd stopped. He picked up a stone. It was flat on one side and rounded on the other, like a hemisphere. It was completely free of dirt and all its little fissures, as though someone had painstakingly cleaned it. A heavy hand landed on Roberto's shoulder. He jumped around. Arbeiter was saying something to him. He took the stone from Roberto and turned it over in his hand. He said something again, quick and to the point. Whatever it was, Roberto knew looking at the ground wouldn't get him out of this one. Oh, please, let Arbeiter not have seen the girl put the stone there. Oh, please, please. Let it only be Roberto who was in trouble. Roberto reached into his pocket and pulled out another stone. He handed it to Arbeiter. He said, "It's my collection." None of the soldiers had ever given any indication that they understood Italian, but maybe that was just an act to fool the boys into saying dangerous things. Roberto took a third stone out of his other pocket. He pointed to a discoloration on one side of it. "See, if I knew anything about rocks, I could tell you what that was there. But I don't know anything. I just collect them because I need to. If you were me, you'd collect something too. It helps." Arbeiter just looked at the discolored stone. Roberto dared to take the girl's stone from Arbeiter's hand. He replaced it quickly with a discolored stone. He held up the girl's stone in front of Arbeiter's nose. "It's flat on one side as though it's only half of something. Only half. I like it, don't you?" He kept an easy tone. Maybe he could soothe his way to safety. He thought of Arbeiter plucking the barbed wire when the little girl was holding tight. It happened so fast, Arbeiter couldn't have planned it. Cruelty was instinctive with him. There was no way anyone could soothe Arbeiter. Roberto tensed up to be ready to take whatever penalty might come. "It's just a collection." He spoke without emotion, though the tears pressed inside his eyes. Arbeiter looked at Roberto. He held the two egg-shaped stones in one hand and picked his teeth with the other. Then, with one hard, fast move, he threw the stones at people in the pen. One smacked the dirt. The other hit a woman on the shoulder. She fell forward on her hands and knees. Something rolled from her skirt. A man snatched it up and stuck it in his mouth as he stumbled away. Arbeiter said, "Tear," and walked off. Roberto stood stock still, his heart beating violently. He watched the woman move slowly to a sitting position. She kept her eyes on the ground and she didn't stand up. But she told himself it was because she didn't want to. He was resting. With one hand, she smoothed her hair, newly graying hair like Roberto's mother's hair. Slowly, she shifted her chin. Slowly, slowly, her hand moved again and again on her hair, with a deliberation that made Roberto want to scream. Just scream and scream and scream. He looked away. He didn't want her to see him watching. The tears behind his eyes had disappeared, leaving a burning dryness. It was a piece of brat that had rolled from the woman's skirt. Roberto was sure of that. That's why she never looked up to see who had taken it. Anyone could have. Anyone would have. They were starving. Roberto slipped the girl's gift stone into his pocket and squeezed it as hard as he could. At dinner, Roberto gave his girl his potato and wurst. He was too hungry to wait, so he ate his brat standing up halfway between the chicken coop and the pen. Enzo was already sitting by the chicken coop, chewing his brat carefully and watching Roberto. The moment felt heavy and ready like a late fall apple. The slowness of everything suddenly filled Roberto with frustration and longing. Roberto didn't even look around. He walked quickly past Enzo, straight into the chicken coop as though he were invisible. Food, he said to himself. Food was everyone's right. No one should starve. He had collected 3 eggs and was about to reach under the next hen for a 4th egg when he heard a scraping noise. He turned around. Wasser was in the doorway. Roberto stopped still. He was caught. Finally. Everything seemed to stop. Every little noise, every little movement. The dust of the chicken coop made his eyes sting. It dried the inside of his nose. He sneezed. Wasser didn't speak. He gestured with his chin for Roberto to come on out. Roberto looked slowly at the eggs in his hands, the evidence of his crime. He turned to put the eggs in the closest nest, but the hen on that nest pecked at him and squawked. Stupid hen. Stupid Roberto. Dumb and slow and heavy and stupid. Both of them too hot in this coop. Too hot to breathe. Wasser pulled him by the arm backward out of the chicken coop, still holding the 3 eggs in both hands. Roberto kept his eyes on those eggs. He stumbled along with Wasser pulling him. He put all his concentration on to making sure the eggs didn't fall. If the eggs stayed whole, maybe nothing terrible would happen. He knew this was magic thinking. He knew it was crazy, But he had to keep those eggs whole. The butt of Wasser's gun stuck out of the holster. It was shiny and smooth like an eggshell. Wasser walked him over to the driver of one of the trucks. They talked and pointed at the eggs and talked. Wasser laughed. Then he pushed Roberto ahead of him to the first truck, the only one completely unloaded. He gestured for Roberto to climb into the back. Another journey. The thought exhausted him. Roberto looked at the 3 eggs, still intact. They couldn't help him. Nothing could help him now. He held out the eggs to Wasser. Wasser shook his head. Roberto placed the eggs gently on the ground. Wasser shouted at him. Roberto picked them up. If he put the raw eggs in his pockets and tried to climb into the truck, they'd probably break. He opened his mouth wide and put 1 egg inside his cheek and the 3rd on his tongue. He climbed into the truck and sat with his back against the cab, looking at Wasser. Wasser laughed again. "Excuse me, sir." Wasser turned around. Enzo stood there. He stood tall, his shoulders squared. He was only a head shorter than Wasser, but he had half his girth. "I stole eggs, too." He gestured the act of reaching for an egg, then popping it in his mouth. "I did it, too." His voice grew louder and trembled slightly. "I'd rather die than let my friend take the punishment alone, you big lump of pig dung." His face was expressionless, and he spoke in a monotone. He pulled the St. Christopher medal out from inside his shirt and ran it back and forth along the chain. "As this saint, whatever his name is my witness, I stole eggs and I'd like to puke them all over your fat head." Roberto sat immobile in the truck. He was stunned. It made no sense for both of them to get in trouble. And he couldn't believe Enzo had called Wasser names. Enzo, of all people, could never afford to be reckless, even for a moment. All the remaining energy went out of Roberto's body as though he would collapse, as though he were the woman hit by the rock who wouldn't stand up again. This was it. Everything was over. Wasser barked at Enzo to get back into the truck. Then he walked off, while another soldier watched them both. Roberto took the eggs out of his mouth and set them in his lap. "Why did you do that? Why did you tell him?" "If you left, I'd slowly starve. Whatever happens to us now, it can't be worse than that." It was true. Roberto put his hand over the lump in his pocket, the lump that was the stone the girl had given him. She would starve. Her little sister would starve. How could he have let himself get caught like that? And now anger welled up. Anger at himself and at Enzo. Why did you call him names on top of it? If he understood, everything would have been much worse. The other Italian boys can't even understand Venetian dialect when we speak fast, so how can he understand us? Roberto still shook his head. He could have been pretending not to understand just so he could hear us say secrets. "That's ridiculous. Anyway, what did I say that was so bad?" "You said you wanted to puke on him." "I did, didn't I?" Enzo's voice was full of wonder. Roberto nodded. "I do. I want to puke on him." Enzo took a deep breath. "It's a good thing it was Wasser and not Arbeiter. Arbeiter would have killed you for sure, and me too." A shiver ran through Roberto. Arbeiter was probably suspicious of him after the incident with the stones today. He probably watched Roberto carefully whenever he happened to see him. Arbeiter was the one who was most likely to have caught Roberto in the chicken coop, but it was Wasser who did. Wasser. Wasser actually thinks he's nice to us. He's just a dumb jerk, but Arbeiter's a real sadist. Enzo shook his head. "We're still alive because of Wasser." "Maybe not." "Huh? Maybe someone else saved us." Roberto touched the medal around Enzo's neck. "His name is St. Christopher. He watches over travelers." Enzo looked solemnly at Roberto, then he took an egg and held it up high. "To St. Christopher," he said. Roberto raised an egg. "To St. Christopher." They cracked them together, and raw egg ran down their arms. Enzo licked his off. "Might as well not waste them. Who knows if we'll ever eat again." Roberto licked his off too. Raw egg was actually close to delicious mixed with the salty sweat on his arm. Wasser came back. He looked at them and laughed. He handed them each a wurst. He said something. He gestured for them to eat up. Roberto took his wurst and looked quickly at Enzo. Enzo took the wurst. Then he grabbed the 3rd egg from Roberto's lap and dropped the wurst in its place. "I prefer eggs," he said to Wasser. "Eggs, you dumb goat head." Roberto put the 2nd wurst in his pocket. He ate the 1st wurst. Enzo ate the 3rd egg. Wasser shook his head at Enzo but didn't say anything. And in that moment, Roberto realized Enzo was right. Wasser felt benevolent toward the boys in his charge. He didn't see them as prisoners. He had no sense of their homesickness or hunger. The enormity of Wasser's stupidity left Roberto aghast. The other soldier got in the front of the truck and revved up the engine. Wasser waved. He put both hands on his belly and said something and nodded. He waved again. Enzo hooked his arm through Roberto's. He sat straight, his chin high. Roberto tried to do the same. They could hear Wasser's laugh as they rolled down the road.